Today, we're going to be looking at the electoral systems because arguably this is the most important and valuable part that exists in the Canadian parliamentary system. So let's get started. What we're going to be looking at is a general idea of what the history of voting has been like in Canada. Do we need to make any changes? What are elections like in other countries? We'll review once again what the difference is between majority and minority governments. And what are the electoral systems with the idea of making changes. And one item that definitely shows the idea of change was the former Prime Minister Stephen Harper when he first became the leader of the new Conservative Party of Canada after the Progressive Conservatives and the Canadian Alliance merged to form the Conservative Party, which would result in Stephen Harper winning a minority government later on. Now, unfortunately, there are a few really important key terms that you want to know. It might be a good idea if you need to pause the recording at this point to make sure you understand it. Essentially, a constituency is a body of voters that are represented by an elected person or official. A constituency is kind of like, imagine the entire country is like a giant jigsaw puzzle, and each piece, 338 for the lower House of Commons, is a constituency, and each person votes in someone to represent them in the House of Commons. Because remember, Canada is a representative democracy, not a direct democracy as it was with the ancient Greeks. Franchise is the right to vote. As covered before, the right to vote is guaranteed in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The difference between a majority and a minority government is first, while both still do have a political party that wins an election, winning will have more votes or people elected compared to others. A majority means over half the seats are one party, whereas minority, no one has half of the seats or constituencies voted for them. That is really the difference between majority and minority. Traditionally, in Canadian federal politics, the governments have tended to be majority. Though in recent years, in the early 21st century, there has been more minority governments rather than majority governments. But that is either negative or positive, as both have their benefits and detractors. For the types of election systems that exist, first is first past the post, which is a system where a candidate with the most amount of votes wins. If she or she receives less than 50% of the votes, sometimes it's called a simple majority. The first past the post is the system we use in Canada. It's a good made for television. Proportional representation is a system in which the number of seats a political party wins is based upon the overall percentage of support done in the vote. A hybrid is a combination of both first past the post and proportional representation. And finally, preferential ballot is a system where you have large constituencies, and in these large constituencies, multiple people are voted in based upon rank, first choice, second, third, fifth, etc. choices. Each choice carries a point total. Historically, this painting might be familiar to you. This is the Fathers of Confederation with John A. Macdonald and Great Coalition at the Charlottetown Conference, the first of three conferences that will lead to the founding of the Dominion of Canada of the 1st of July, 1867. By historically voting, when the first election was held in Canada, only 11% of the population was eligible to vote. Most people were not eligible to vote. It was a very selective, privileged few. However, today, 68% of Canada's population can vote. It's a lot more inclusive. But there are issues where not everyone who is eligible to vote will vote. For voting when it comes to women, due to the efforts of Nellie McClung, Manitoba was the first province to give the women the right to vote at provincial level. Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, 1916. BC, Ontario, 1917. Nova Scotia, 1918. Note the whole timing around the First World War. 1919, New Brunswick. 1922, Prince Edward Island. 1925, Newfoundland. And then finally, 1940 was Quebec. A lot of values that we hold dear as Canadians do come from our prairie provinces, such as the voting for women, universal pension plan, universal health care, etc. For the timeline of the history of the vote of federal elections in Canada, in 1874, booths were created to give the voter a sense of privacy. You don't have to share whether you vote for or support or not. In 1918, women were given the right to vote at the federal level. In 1919, women were given the right to run NFL politics. In 1920, the Federal Electoral Officer of Canada was hired to oversee the administration of federal elections. And in 1921, Angus MacPhail became the first woman elected to the House of Commons. This is the Alberta 5, which we'll look more into at a different time. In 1950, the Inuit people gained the right to vote. 1955, the last vestiges of religious-based discrimination were removed from election law. In 1960, the First Nations who were living on reserves were given the right to vote, and they did not have to give up their status. And then finally, in 1970, the voting age was lowered from 21 to 18 at the federal level. In 1982, the right to vote and the candidate were enshrined in our Constitution because of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. A decade later, in 1992, the Elections Act amended to make sure everyone can vote, no matter what kind of mental and or physical disabilities they may have, such as interpreting services, wheelchair access, technology to assist, etc. 1993, federally appointed judges will appoint people with mental disabilities and persons serving prison terms to right to vote. 2002, following Supreme Court of Canada, the people who are in jail can actually vote. Does not mean they can participate and run for election for a seat, but they can still exercise their right. One thing about the Canadian Charter is that the word is vague and open to interpretations. This is an example of that. Now we've got a little bit of history. A question we need to ask is, do we need to make any changes? Are the voting decisions of Canadians based upon are accurate? Does the actual House of Commons, the lower house, actually truly represent the people? And if not, do we need to change then? A common question could be, if 10% of Canadians vote for the Green Party, shouldn't the Green Party get 10% of the seats? Until recent elections, the Green Party has garnered either 1, 2, or 3 seats. Before then, before Elizabeth May became the leader of the Green Party, while they were getting support, it never actually materialized into any actual persons being elected. The classic example of 2006 is the federal election results, where the Conservatives had 36% of the vote, the Liberals had 30% of the vote, but there's a difference of 19 seats, even though that's less than a 6% difference between the two sides. 2006 was when Stephen Harper would win his first minority government. Also noteworthy with the population of the vote percentage, 36, wow, that's not half. And actually, one thing about the results is that typically a party needs to win 40% of the popular vote to win a majority government. That's what typically has been done, but recently, not every party has been needing to achieve that 40% of the vote to even win. Others, like the Liberals, federally, or the NDP at the BC provincial level have achieved this with around 37 or 38%. What are some of the issues? First, unfairness to respect of representation. Voters who choose to support one another of smaller parties are not having their voices represented there, such as the Green Party. Second issue, low voter turnout. In Canada, it's been since 1988, there's been a decline in voters turning up on election day to vote. Many Canadians feel that their vote does not count or does not matter, so why bother? And 2004 was actually the lowest the actual turnout since 1898. Their problem are strange results that have occurred in elections. Fourth problem, sometimes results can be so one-sided that there is no official opposition. This happened in New Brunswick in 1987 when the Liberal Party won all 58 seats in the legislature in Nova Scotia. The government had no opposition. Well, impressive as it was in the victory, there is no accountability for that government during that time. British Columbia also has a similar one with Gordon Campbell, where in Gordon Campbell's first election win, the BC Liberals achieved 87 seats and the NDP got 2. The NDP were not even granted official party status at that point, even though a month before the NDP were the ruling party. So issue number 4 can be a lack of an effective opposition. So do we need to make changes or not? Some things to consider is, do we keep the current first past the post system or not there? Or should we do a proportional representation, try a hybrid, or go the Australian route with a preferential ballot? So what is the first past the post, FPTP? First past the post is an electoral system used by Canadians in Canadian election. The candidate essentially with the most amount of number of votes in his seat wins. The political party that wins the most amount of seats will win the government, win the election, and will essentially form government. Whoever is the leader of the party that wins the election becomes either the premier of the province, if it's a provincial election, or becomes the prime minister, the leader of the government. Yeah, first past the post is kind of like a horse race. Whoever gets over the finish line first with the most amount of votes wins. It's simple and straightforward and good for television. While first past the post can tend to produce more majority governments, which can be viewed as more stable, while the system is simple, and it does prevent some extremist groups from being able to gain any sort of a foothold. The negatives is that candidates may not always have a clear mandate there. Majority governments are made on very weak results there. Smaller political parties don't really have a chance of winning it all. It's just the big parties, Conservative, Liberal, NDP, Bloc Québécois, and the Greens there. Even though some Canadians would prefer to have a smaller party that suits their interests better. Now, a proportional representation is a system mainly used in Europe, especially in places like Denmark, Sweden, Finland, and Holland. Proportional representation allocates seats in the parliament based upon the political party's share of the popular vote. If your party receives 10% of the overall vote, you'll get 10% of your seats. 100 seats, 10%, 10 seats, right? It's based upon your overall support, popular support. While smaller parties like Green, NDP, have liked this idea, the big political parties do not like this idea at all. For the proportional representation, voting decisions are represented there. There's a wider selection, some more variety, diversity, but it can have some negatives there, as there tends to be not any majority governments. Things can be a lot more tense there. Elections can happen every year, so the cost becomes more expensive, and it does give possibility for fringe groups, extremist groups, to potentially gain a national foothold. A hybrid system is used in New Zealand, Germany, and Italy. And hybrid is kind of what the name implies. It combines both first past the post and proportional representation. It's commonly referred to as the mixed member proportional system, MPP. Both BEC and PEI have tried to adopt the system, but attempts have both have failed. Ontario has explored this and has also not succeeded. That's what I think too. In our elections, we've talked about making changes. Attempts have been made, but nothing has ever been achieved. Some positive and negatives about it. It does bring both the good and bad of both systems. It can be very confusing since you're not voting for the party, you're voting a representative there. It can be very slow and time consuming in its cost. And then the last system is the preferential ballot. And the preferential ballot is used by Australia. Essentially, in this system, voters will rank the order of preference of who they wish to vote and represent them. Constituencies tend to be big. We have multiple candidates in each riding. And this is a system that is commonly used in Australia. It does not achieve results immediately that same election night as first past the post tends to be, but it does give a lot more variety there. And while members of parliament would need to 50% of the vote to win, voters' decisions would be reflected upon the election outcomes. But it is slow, expensive, and confusing there. And people don't need to vote for one person; they need to vote for up to 5 different individuals. So, on one side, it is good to actually enforce more voter engagement and knowledge of what's happening, but there's also the pushback against forcing people to be more involved in election systems than they did not want to be. So that is our opening talk on the election systems.